William Marshal needs no introduction. He's the most famous knight in history. He served 4 kings, 5 if you include Henry the Young King. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. Before I begin the tale of William Marshal, first I have to set the scene, for it was a time of pure, bloody chaos. The Norman conquest was less than a century ago, and Christians still held the Holy Land. But due to the tragedy of the White Ship disaster, where the heir apparent, William Atheling, perished, King Henry I had passed away, promising the crown to his daughter, Empress Matilda, only for his nephew, Stephen of Blois, to usurp the throne, and plunging the kingdom into a bitter civil war. This is the period known as the Anarchy. Our story starts in 1147, and King Stephen has been on the throne for around 15 years. The Anarchy has been dragging on for 10. During this time of war and desolation, John Marshal, a minor nobleman in the West Country of England, had managed to get on the wrong side of Patrick, the Earl of Salisbury, who ruled the nearby Old Sarum. Soon, John was cowed and Patrick dominant, and John ends up marrying Patrick's sister, Sybil, and his wife had a son, William, the hero of our story. Now, the Anarchy swung both ways. At one time, Stephen was defeated and held captive. Another time, Matilda had to flee for her life, Earl Robert of Gloucester covering her retreat. And William's father John had switched sides during the Anarchy. And in 1141, he was now serving under Empress Matilda. Apparently, it was John Marshal who told Matilda not to ride side saddle during the flight, at least according to the histories of William Marshal. Also in the histories, it is John Marshal that replaces Gloucester in not just the riding, but the one who covered her retreat in the first place. Make of it what you wish. Because, as is often during this period, there are exaggerations and tall tales hidden among absolute truths. It is our job to find them and take them with a pinch of salt. But there is an element of truth to this particular tale, as John Marshal's face was said to be scarred from an injury he suffered during the flight from the Siege of Winchester. Here Matilda's forces were holed up at Warewell Abbey, which was then attacked by Stephen's army. The abbey was set on fire. The lead in the roof had melted, deforming John Marshal. He even lost an eye. But, more importantly, he escaped. This is the father of the legend we know, the Philip to Alexander, a brutal 12th century commander with a penchant for blood. He didn't have the reputation of a nice man, not by any account. He was a bit of a brute. And this is where William enters the story proper. And unlike knights like Longspee and de Blois, we know quite a lot about the childhood of William Marshal, just not his infant years. I mean, we can only assume he survived the first 5 years in Newbury Castle. Yes, survived. For the record, we're in an era where a third of children died within a year of birth. A lot of others didn't even reach puberty. There are tales of children who fell down wells or off castle walls. Cautious tales. And sure, the nobility had an advantage, and William would have seen luxury living, the good food and the best medicine. But no one was immune to the wheel of fate. Everything was God's will in his era. Women still lamented the dead, just as they do today. A life is a life. And people were known to be stricken with grief. Even there, in the long-lost past. Life wasn't as cheap as people make it out to be. And William survives his first ordeal in the cruel years of the 12th century. Because in 1152, we're in the late stages of the anarchy, and Stephen was on the warpath. You see, the whole conflict was a stalemate. Stephen was desperate and needed to assert authority. So he sieges the newly built Newbury Castle, and this is where John Marshal resided. The king's army laid siege, and to force a truce, Stephen demands a hostage to guarantee his loyalty. John Marshal has a few older sons, but instead of handing any of them over to Stephen, he hands over his youngest, William, a pup who is but 5 years of age. Now, John Marshal wasn't initially present at the siege of Newbury. It was defended by a small garrison, and negotiations and threats were carried out via correspondence. But when John promised that he'll talk to his men, Stephen withdrew and allowed the Marshal to access his castle to parley with the garrison, get them to surrender. Yeah, but the second John was behind the walls, the wily old scallywag turned against the usurper and prepared defences. The rotter! And remember that Stephen still has his youngest son. And unfortunately for the young pup, his father had no want for peace. He was far too stubborn. War was his friend. So the burden was on King Stephen, who wasted no time in putting his promises into action. Thus begins the first of 3 trials that the young William would face in his baptism of fire. Firstly, the boy was to be hung by the neck, strangled for all to see, forcing his father to capitulate. Only John does not care. He claims to have the anvil and tongs to make more and better sons. The boy's mother Sybil grieved, but John did nothing. The siege went on. Secondly, the boy was led to a trebuchet and told to sit in it, the plan being to cast the child into the castle walls. Still, his father refused to capitulate. The third attempt was to use the boy as a human shield as Stephen's army assaulted the walls of Newbury Castle. But fortunately, Stephen was no monster. He simply could not do it. Besides, William lived in the camp now, and the king had grown used to the child. He's always asking questions, apparently even showing martial prowess, even playing with a guard's spear, a foreshadow of the future. King Stephen is reported to have claimed that anyone willing to let that child die in agony had a cruel heart indeed. Thus Stephen spared William. The king would take the castle at Newbury, but John Marshal had escaped, leaving his son in the hands of Stephen. And young William would remain at the king's camp for many more months, apparently as long as a year. They even played games together, if the Marshal's histories are anything to go by, and the young boy was even allowed to play knights games, another foreshadow of the future. But King Stephen's fortunes would soon change, because Empress Matilda's teenage son, Henri, the Count of Anjou, had landed in England at the head of an army, putting the fight to the usurper. Stephen may have been a king, but he was losing power. Then, when his eldest son died, there would be a truce at Winchester. He disinherited his other son and passed the right of the heir to Henri. The anarchy was over, and young Henri of Anjou, the son of Godefroy de Plantagenet, was now the true heir. He'd be king when Stephen died, which he did unexpectedly in 1154. Henri II, who we know as Henry, now ruled the kingdom with his wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. They're a 12th century power couple, and Empress Matilda retires and returns to Normandy. Right. And our young pup, William Marshal, most likely returned back to the West Country and his family. Growing up, he'd be taught to read, write, learn scripture. He'd be taught how to ride a horse at an early age. The young lad would grow tall, apparently around 6 feet, which was good for this era. And he had a good stature. And apparently, he had remarkably chiselled features. But he wasn't a son of a powerful magnate who rubbed shoulders with the king. His father was a minor noble whose only claim to fame was aiding Empress Matilda almost 2 decades ago. Sure, they were nobility, but they were not rich. Not by the standards of the aristocracy of the 12th century. Plus, William was one of 3 surviving brothers, and only the eldest, named after his father, John, would inherit the lands and the honorary title of Marshal. So in a will dated 1158, young William's name appears at the bottom, and he'd receive nothing upon his father's death. Going by records, it seems his father fell on pretty hard times. William was only around 11 when he found this out, his father being as cold as he was back at the siege of Newbury. Still, William would use the name Marshal anyway, even though he didn't have the honorary position. So, in a way, he's using it like a proto-surname, most likely to boost his prestige going forward. As this young lad was destined to become a knight and groomed into the military way of life, William would have been familiar with the ins and outs of castle life, the chores, the routine, the training, seeing the patterns of the garrison and becoming familiar with the various weaponry of the 12th century. Now, among the nobility, it was common practice for boys who reached around 8 years old to send them off to live with distant relatives, just for a few years to break them away from the family environment and toughen them up a little. Yet, most likely due to his father's hard times, William Marshal was around 13 when he himself was sent away overseas, to the chateau of a Norman baron known as Guillaume de Tongeville. It seems like his mother, Sybil of Salisbury, had pulled a few strings, as Guillaume is a relative of hers. So, in 1160, William Marshal leaves England for Normandy to live in a castle in a remote village. His mother was emotional, as were his brothers, who were there to see him off. Tears flowed. His father hadn't even bothered to show up. Thus, William, only 13, heads off to a foreign land, Normandy, his only companion being a loyal servant. Well, I say foreign land. Tongeville is only about half a day's walk from Rouen, less if you use a pogo stick, and I might have to explain a few things regarding Normandy. At the 3rd quarter of the 12th century, Normandy was still very much part of the domain under the English king. We're in the Angevin era. Eleanor of Aquitaine, once the Queen of France, had annulled her marriage to the French king and rushed off to marry Henri Fils-Empress, i.e. Henry II. France's lands switched almost overnight, and Henry, now has a vast empire stretching from Newcastle all the way down to the Spanish border, all controlled by various counts and dukes. Travel between England and the continental lands is frequent, other than the Channel, which can still be a danger, and a few gangs of bandits here and there, William can relax as he travels across Normandy. So it's not like William Marshal and his servant are traversing hostile territory. Plus, he's heading for ancestral lands because he's from Norman heritage. So it's very much like an American who goes to stay at the home of their French great-uncle, or that French relative heading over to New York. Sacré bleu! He'll be familiar with much of the customs. He speaks the language, albeit with an English twang. Actually, on that, his accent is known as Marlborough French, as the West Country accent is pretty thick. And the joke was, in Normandy, that the springs in Marlborough were cursed because whoever drank from the springs in Marlborough ended up speaking really bad French. Apparently, the local Normans would have found it quite funny indeed, and some would have been quite elitist about it. So take that in mind. William Marshal would have sounded more like Hagrid from Harry Potter. Imagine Hagrid speaking French. Two-way on sorcerer, Harry. But soon, William Marshal will arrive at his destination, a Château de Tonquerville, where he would begin his training as a knight. Though he wouldn't be a squire, not in this era. That concept comes much later. Sure, the term was used, but not in the way we'd use it. It was often nothing less than a servant who wouldn't become a knight, rather than a boy who will one day become one. The castle itself, as I mentioned earlier, was run by a baron called Guillaume de Tonquerville. But he's not just any baron, he's the Chamberlain of Normandy, taking orders from the Duke of Normandy himself, who at this time was King Henry II of England, aka Henry II of England. He's the son of Empress Matilda, as we knew earlier. And the household of Guillaume was on a different scale than what William was used to over in Wiltshire. So I suppose I'll have to explain the concept of the Minier, the military household that made up the Norman aristocracy. Basically, a knight would be surrounded by a military retinue, sometimes as few as a dozen. It could reach up into the hundreds. It depends on the knight in question. He could be a low-ranking baron. He could be a high-ranking earl. Even the king was a knight, and had to go through the same training that William Marshal is about to go through. And teenage William would already be familiar with the Minier, as his father would have had one. His biography mentions that William remembered that his father had the responsibility of kitting out his Minier, supplying them with weapons and armour, and livery. It was the Lord's job to kit out his men, show largesse, a part of the ideal of chivalry. A good baron would have his men kitted out in the finest clothing, lovely bright colours, the best horses. They'd eat the best food in a great hall, drink the best wines. They would live well. The more rich the baron, the more opulent and lavish this would be. And William Marshal is certainly living a good life when he arrives at Tonquerville, as it is mentioned that he enjoyed the best food, the finest food. Now, some read this as him being at the high table, where the salt was. But it could equally be that the general standard of living was more elite than what William was used to, back in Wiltshire, at the Minier of his father. Here, sitting at the second mess or reward tables would no doubt have been more opulent than the high table of John Marshal. Probably why William takes a liking to good food. Apparently, he's quite a piggywig. He had a nickname, Auguste de Viande, which is roughly translated as glutton, because apparently he had a reputation for eating and sleeping way too much. In other words, a typical teenager. But he's good in a saddle and easily picked up the skills needed to become the legend he would one day be. And it wasn't all about military training, as knights were the nobility, the aristocracy. They were also politicians and landowners, the equivalent of MPs and senators. They had the king's ear, as well as his back. So William would have been drilled with the standards of etiquette that was expected of the era. From eating properly in the Great Hall, to how to conduct yourself at the royal court. These were not uncivilized times. No matter what Hollywood tried to predict, people were not throwing chicken bones over their shoulders. They were not urinating against the walls. Well, the Lord was allowed to, but the rest, no, they can do it outside. These were not the Dark Ages. These were more refined times, and a level of decent etiquette was needed. It's the chivalric ideal of Prudhomme, being the best man you can be, which included not losing your cool by some drunken whippersnapper at the king's banquet. You were on your best behaviour at all times. Well, that's the theory anyway. Obviously this slipped often, and more than often, it's the king himself who's being the pillock and throwing the tantrum. King John, I'm looking at you. At Tocqueville, William Marshal's training would last 6 whole years. Over this time, he was already getting a name for himself, if his biography is anything to go by. Sure, it's most likely biased, but given the soldier he grew up to be, it's certainly got an element of truth to it. We even know that his swordsmanship didn't have much finesse, instead relying on crushing blows that swiftly overpowered opponents. He was even more effective with a lance, which required good strength, because they are not carrying balsa wood, they are carrying a 12-foot-long ash spear. All the eating was paying off. In 1166, at around the age of 20, he finally graduated, which involved a knighting ceremony that was held not at Tocqueville, but Neufchâtel-en-Bray, which was a day's ride away. There, the Minier joined with other lords, including the Constable of Normandy, Jourdan d'Aumale. There the Marshal would be knighted, along with many others. But the Tocqueville Minier don't appear to be spending their time in the castle itself during their stay. Instead, they are lodging in the town. There are many nobles here, a good few hundred. A war band is being gathered to deal with the growing tensions on the borders, so there wouldn't be much room in the castle itself. So it makes sense that the Minier found other lodgings, and it also appears that Guillaume de Tocqueville resided with them, despite his much higher station. After all, he is the father of knights. He's proud of his men. They are his retinue. Now, I will stress, we are not in the age of tapping fancy swords on shoulders. We are pretty much in the early years of what we would call knights. Sure, the belting rituals were becoming more elaborate from what was once regular military horsemen, like in the days of the Conqueror. And sure, they were becoming more gentrified by each coming year, often involving ritual baths and silk garments. But this won't be the pomp of the Victorian age, complete with king and cushion. And there you go, you blighter. Elaborate as they were, this was still a battlefield commission, and reflected it as such. Especially as there was tension on the Norman borders. War was breaking out, with domains such as Flanders, Ponthieu, and Boulogne. More knights are needed. It was William, Lord of Tocqueville, who knighted the Marshal, giving him the sword and belt, a symbol of his new status as part of the upcoming elite, along with a fine cloak to fit this new station. Then he'd receive the collet, a good punch to the body, the last blow he'd ever receive without retaliation. The child had become a man. Then, naturally, they had the obligatory feast. As I said a moment ago, conflict with neighbouring Flanders is on the horizon. There is a reason why the new knights are here, as a warband is being gathered at the castle of Neufchâtel-en-Brie. It's overlooking the town, situated by a river. As for the conflict, it's one of those situations where the cause is long lost. We don't even know what started it, but fighting looks inevitable, so everyone must have been on edge. Now the plan is to gather the warband, then ride onward to thwart a possible invasion. But unfortunately the enemy had not been idle, and launches a deadly attack on the town. Now, the Tonqueville Meunier is stationed in the town, not the castle, as Sir Guillaume gathers 28 of his best knights before riding out to meet this Flemish invasion force head on, planning to cut the invaders off at a bridge crossing. William Marshal was among them. He'd only been a knight a few days, if that. At this time of his life, he is young, impetuous and reckless. As the retinue cantered through the streets towards the bridge, the Marshal rides ahead, determined to get first blood, overtaking many of the more seasoned knights, which caused controversy. As for the battle, we don't know numbers. We don't really know how large this skirmish was. It may have been just a small raid. It could have been part of a larger battle. We cannot know for sure. Except that, as the Normans rode on, it appears that the enemy knights had already crossed into the town via the bridge, and were riding past a farmstead. And not just knights, but also foot soldiers. All hell broke loose, as both sides lowered lances and charged each other. This wasn't a romanticised, chivalric tale from a troubadour. This was battle. Real battle. The two sides slammed into each other with great impact, shattering lances before breaking off into what can only be described as a dogfight. Everywhere knights were riding about in a disorganised maelstrom, with every man desperately trying to overcome their opponent. It's a swirling melee, with the backdrop of several farmsteads. It is said that William Marshal was cool-headed. Discarding his broken lance, he drew his sword, then confronted his foe. He fights multiple opponents, delivering many hard blows as the fight continued. But it does appear that he got a bit carried away, and he ends up separated from the Meunier, cornered by a farmhouse. Now, young William is on his own, and unaware that his own side is losing the fight. Guillaume is sounding the retreat. The Marshal's reaction? He picks up an unused lance from the ground, then charges his closest opponent, sending the Flemish foe from his horse. Bellowing the battle cry, "Tonqueville!" he presses on, taking the fight to Flanders. This act rallies the Normans, who charge back into the fray. Now the real fight erupts. Circling around, the Marshal heads back to the farmhouse to grab another lance. He's trying the same trick again, only to find 13 Flemish soldiers have retaken the place. They immediately try to down this pesky knight. At first, they are absolutely outclassed. These are lightly armoured men in gamsons, and William is clad in mail atop a destrier. They don't stand a chance. That is, until one of the Flemish soldiers spies a billhook used for thatched roofs. He gets this hook and uses it to drag the Marshal from his horse, tearing the Marshal's mail and ripping into his shoulder. But William proved stronger and tore free of the billhook. Streaming blood and armour in serious need of repair, The Marshal took off down the dirt track, trying to get back to the main fight, only his horse had been mortally wounded and would not survive the day. As William looked on, the Flemish invaders retreated the field, and they would not return. The Marshal's first battle had been won, but at a cost, because destrier horses are not cheap. At least Neufchâtel-en-Bray belonged to the Normans. And you'll never guess what happens next. Yep, they all celebrate the victory with another large banquet, and the ale and wine flowed freely. And here, at the feast, the Marshal learns that the other knights have taken spoils of war, so ransoms. So from now on, William's focus won't be on crushing his enemies, but instead focusing on the financial aspect, the ransom. Unfortunately for William, after the brief conflict, when the Chamberlain's Menier returned to Tonquerville, Guillaume decided to downsize that Menier, there being no war, thus no need for it. He required only his most seasoned and loyal knights, and William Marshal was inexperienced and one of those that had to go. Now, all the recruits who'd previously been knighted, they had no master, no Menier, worse for Marshal, no warhorse. As only the Menier can rely on the Lord to supply such things, now the Marshal, along with many a knight, was on his own. So, what do you do in such a circumstance? Many in this situation became mercenaries. With just a palfrey and his loyal servant, the Marshal was about to face the world. And it's not like he can even return home, as his estranged father had passed away the previous year, leaving the estate to the elder brother, the second John Marshal. But this would mean coming back to serve in his brother's shadow. I mean, William could have asked to join at Menier, but it appears that he had bigger ambitions, or at least he sees a bigger paycheck, as at the moment he had nothing. The Marshal ends up selling his lovely cloak, the one he earned as a knight, for 5.5 sterling shillings. Okay, that's still a pretty penny, but bugger all for a knight. And that money he spent on a pack horse. Okay, he still got all his equipment, his armour, his weaponry, and all that came with it, because William is about to go on tour, hitting the famed Norman tournament circuit. And he's about to make a name for himself. What had emerged as a method to control and prevent the increasing amount of knights from tearing the place up in peacetime had evolved into a series of organised events where knights could find money and renown. They are just not the one-on-one tilt-style jousts we are familiar with, not in a 12th century, but mock battles involving hundreds, if not thousands of knights conducted over multiple fields. It's pretty much a medieval festival involving camps and entertainment and the like. But it's not really for the public, and not as we'd imagine, though sometimes structures were built where people could watch. And on one occasion, it is noted in the Marshal's histories that a gaggle of noble ladies were in attendance as spectators. And naturally anyone around could just stand and watch anyway. But as a rule of thumb, tournaments were primarily things where you didn't watch, but participated. In the 12th century at least. Knights would travel from event to event in a never-ending spiral of glory and renown. And it's not just for unemployed knights. Many barons attend these tournaments. Royalty attend tournaments. Though, it's not guaranteed money. it's a gamble. It all revolves around the concept of ransom, because you're not killing each other, you're capturing one another. And a lot of money is changing hands. Many knights end up in crippling debts, but if you've got what it takes, you could end up rich. Stinking rich. And in 1166, William Marshal learns of a tournament, a large tournament, being held around 120 miles south in Le Mans, which at this point belonged to the Count of Anjou, who just happened to be the King of England, Henry II. So no, the area's not French, and no, the king is not present. But one king was present, King William of Scotland, a chap only in his 20s, is only a year into his reign, and he's brought a sizable retinue. Because Le Mans was an important event. If you were known, you were here. Enter the Chamberlain, once again, Guillaume of Tonquerville. Because William's old mentor is also going to be attending the tournament at Le Mans. His team, for lack of a better word, is made up of 40 knights. So the Marshal approaches Guillaume, and yes, the Marshal is accepted back into the Minier to join the tournament team. Happy days. But one problem still remained, a warhorse. So William asks for one. For context, this is like going back to your old schoolmaster and saying, "Oh, sorry, old boy, couldn't possibly have a brand new Ferrari to compete in the Le Mans 24-hour, eh?" Yeah, he's told no. But Guillaume does give it some second thought. After all, he does pity him, and he does want the best team for the job, so he capitulates. Thus, William gets his horse, a destrier horse, the last one in the stable. Now the next problem, because there's a reason why this horse is the last one in the stable, as it was deemed unrideable, untamed. So William decides to lose his harness, calming the beast down somewhat. And during the warm-up matches, the Marshal would have plenty of practice to get some experience. Because this time, the Marshal was determined not to lose the horse. For the main event, there would be two main teams, made up of several minor teams, who would fight over many acres of field near the city of Le Mans itself. And as the two sides clashed, William first locates an unnamed knight with little renown and clobbers him over the head with the butt of his broken lance, taking the chap out of the fight and sending him back to the camp of Lord Tonquerville as a prisoner, whose forfeit was to hand over some prize money to the Marshal. But this was a small amount of coin, as he was a low-ranking knight, like the Marshal himself. What's needed is a bigger prize, someone with a name, someone with renown, and William sets his eyes on Philip of Vallon. He's the Chamberlain of Scotland and part of the King's personal retinue. The Marshal didn't bother with his lance. Instead, he simply rides at speed. He grabs the bridle of Philip's horse, an outrageous move. Anyone who's ridden a horse will know how hard this is. Then, as blows rained down upon his helm, William leads the horse off the field and captured a hefty ransom. No bad blood. Chivalry prevailed as the two men discussed the terms of the ransom. As a knight, Philip's word was bond, because this is very much a gentleman's sport. Then, once terms had been met, both men rode back into the fight to enjoy the rest of the event. In one day, this knight-errant, William Marshal, had earned a whopping great amount of money. Not just coin, but now he had 4 war horses, though still only one destrier, the expensive ones. But this is about to set a precedent, as the Marshal went from tournament to tournament, racking up win after win. More, he was making a name for himself. And this was the Marshal's life for the next couple of years. travelling the circuit from tournament to tournament, gaining renown, and more importantly, coin. He was only in his early 20s and already more wealthy than many of the barons. And William was still just a knight-errant, a ronin, so to speak. He had no lord. His only masters were God and King Henry II. At one tournament at Boyer, 5 knights decided to get one over on the Marshal, singling him out and piling on him. But they could not unhorse the champion, so resorted to battering his helm and twisting it so it faced backwards. But William kicked his horse into a gallop and broke free, all the while riding with his helm on back to front, slowly suffocating him. So he had to hurt his hand, bending the metal to finally remove the helm. This is how these events were. They were often dangerous. Though he didn't always escape getting captured, especially as he was getting a name for himself, thus becoming more of a target. Many people were jealous of him, because despite being a newly knighted whippersnapper, he was beating the best. In one tourney, he was unhorsed by a knight from Flanders, Matthew of Wallingcourt. And despite much haggling, Matthew wouldn't budge and demanded the Marshal's destrier horse. What can you do? But mostly, these were good years. By 1170, it is said that the Marshal was one of the most famous names on the tournament circuit, a true champion. However, by then, he's already pretty much retired from the busy schedule of the tournament circuit, appearing less and less. As in around 1168, William had headed back to England, where these events had long been banned by King Henry II. Though William was not heading back, for the first time in 8 years, to join his brother's Menier. No. There is no evidence he ever bothered to visit his siblings, nor did he visit his father's grave, though he may have seen his mother. After all, Earl Patrick of Salisbury is her brother. He's a seasoned veteran of the anarchy, and Earl Patrick is why the Marshal is here, to join the Salisbury Menier.